excited to talk to you this evening about courageous conversations. And what I mean by that are kind of how do we deal with conflict or those conversations that may come up in our clubs. And you're probably maybe all already starting to think of one of those conversations that maybe you should have with either your club as a whole or with someone individually in your club. So we're just going to share a little bit about conflict management tonight. This is not an easy subject to talk about, and it's not something anyone really loves to do. And so if I can provide a few tips and maybe a few ways to have those conversations, I hope that maybe you can glean just a few things from this. I will be sharing this presentation on our resources page on northcentralpets.org. So don't feel like you need to write down a whole bunch of the information, but I will be sharing the actual slide deck on there so that you can access some of these points later when we're done. But let's kind of dive in. Why are we talking about this? It's because conflict is inevitable. Why is that? It's because no two individuals have exactly the same needs or concerns. Conflict is a natural part of our interactions with each other, whether it's in our personal life or organizational life. So we're going to start with a few basics. How do we define conflict? Textbook-wise, conflict is a state of disagreement or argument between people, groups, or countries, or a situation in which we have to choose between two or more needs or influences, or a disagreement in which the parties involved perceive a threat to their needs, interests, or concerns. We often think of conflict as negative, especially if it makes us feel uncomfortable or it becomes tense or violent. But conflict can be positive, and I urge you to try to take that mindset as we talk about this evening. Positive in the way of debates, brainstorming, or competition even can lead us to better ideas and outcomes in the end. We can generally group causes of conflict into these categories. We can all think of a time when conflict was caused by poor communication or just a general misunderstanding, or unclear expectations. How many times, and maybe you're sitting in the shoes right now, do you feel like maybe you haven't been given clear expectations? That's something that we need to remember as we're moving forward in our present year. Real or perceived unfairness, a manipulative behavior, or harassment or bullying. These are all general causes of conflict. Conflict triggers strong emotions, and it can lead to hurt feelings, disappointment, and discomfort. And when we get to that point, it's much harder to resolve. When handled in an unhealthy manner, it can cause irreparable rifts, resentments, and just plain no longer talking to each other. But when conflict is resolved in a healthy way, it increases our understanding of one another. It builds trust, and it strengthens our relationship bonds. Think about that. It increases our understanding of one another, builds trust, and strengthens our relationship bonds. Doesn't that sound a little bit about what Rotary is like? So what is conflict management? Conflict management is, simply put, how people handle conflict. The goal of conflict management is to reduce the negative aspects of the conflict and use those positive aspects to benefit the relationship or the organization. Just as I mentioned before, let's talk about the positive side of that. So there's 5 different conflict management styles. I'm going to describe each of these a little bit to you. And as I do that, think about where you may land. I'm not going to ask you to say what kind of management style you have, but think in your mind, try to see if you relate to one of these. The first one is accommodating. Accommodating is unassertive, but yet cooperative. The person typically neglects their own concerns to satisfy the concerns of the other person. So you give up thinking about yourself to satisfy the concerns of someone else. Avoiding. Avoiding is unassertive and uncooperative. I think it's fairly obvious that this person pursues neither their own concerns nor that of the other person, and they simply just don't want to deal with conflict, want to go bury our head in the sands and hope that if we ignore it, this issue will go away. We all know that that's not the case. Collaborating, but we also know that a lot of people land in that avoiding area of the world. None of us like to deal with conflict. The third one is collaborating. Collaborating is assertive and cooperative. The parties attempt to work together to find a solution that satisfies everyone's concerns. Competing. Competing is assertive and uncooperative. A person pursues their own concerns without regard for other concerns. This can often be illustrated by the person using their position of power to get their way. So it's not about figuring out the best solution, it's winning and getting your way. And the fifth conflict management style is compromising. Compromising is moderate in both assertiveness and cooperativeness. The object is to find some mutually acceptable solution that partially satisfies all parties. So think about your conflict management style. And I'm just going to have you do this to yourself right now. Think about which style you usually use. And you may not, we're not going to have you say them out loud. You may not be proud to say that you're one of these management styles, but it may be how you are. And that's okay. Because the other key is we need to help seek out the people around us who are able to use some of these management styles and support them in when we are trying to solve some conflict in our clubs or with individual people within our clubs. Can you think of situations in which you'd need or want to use a different style? There might be a situation where collaboration works really well, which, by the way, collaboration is a great style because you attempt to work together to find solutions. It's better than compromising because sometimes compromising, people can walk away not satisfied fully. They might say in the moment that they are, but they're just not quite there. But there might be times when you can use different styles. And maybe it's when the importance level of an issue that comes up. So a lot of people do agree that collaborating is considered the best style, and that's because you've worked together to come to the outcome. Managing and resolving conflict requires emotional maturity, self-control, and empathy. I'm going to say that again because I'm sure it's something we all need to do. I remind myself of this all the time. It's very easy to get wound up and want to jump right in. Managing and resolving conflict requires emotional maturity, self-control, and empathy. It can be tricky, frustrating, and even frightening sometimes. You can ensure that the process is as positive as possible by sticking to some of the following steps. Some of the ways to resolve conflict, and then we're gonna get into some actual tactics here in a moment. But it's key to clarify what the conflict actually is. I think we can probably all in our mind think of a time where maybe someone thought there was a conflict and you were arguing over or discussing something, but it was really something else was the underlying conflict. Clarify truly what the conflict is. Just because someone might be having a bad day or they have other life issues going on, it might not be the conflict you're discussing, it might be a deflection. So clarify what that conflict truly is and define the source of it. Is it something that's one particular instance, or is it something that has been building up? Really try to get to the root of what the actual conflict is. Because once you're able to do that, you can have both parties or everyone involved establish an outcome that we all desire. And when I say an outcome we all desire, that's not a, okay, if it goes this way, I'm going to be happy. It's a, how will we all be happy? We'll all be happy if we can resolve this and move forward. And then we ask for solutions from everyone, from anyone involved in the dispute. And we ask for those, we request those solutions. No ideas are bad ideas here. We're going to make sure that we listen openly. So we can identify then, we can take those solutions and identify those solutions to both sides, solutions that both sides can support, eventually hoping to agree on the best way to reach an outcome. And then another key point here is to determine how to uphold that solution. We want to make sure, as I mentioned before, that people are satisfied with the solution. And how are we going to uphold that? We all know that sometimes we see folks agree to something and then walk out the door and disagree immediately and say, I'm not going to support that. We need to make sure that everyone is supportive and how we're going to uphold that and maintain that. That's key. So, how do we actually do that? That's the question. The first key is that you need to make the relationship your priority. Maintaining and strengthening relationships rather than winning the argument should always be your first priority. We need to take that winning the argument out of the equation. Be respectful of the other person and his or her viewpoint. One more thing before we jump into this even more, though, we also need to know when to let something go. If you can't come to an agreement, it's okay to agree to disagree. It takes two people to keep an argument going. If a conflict is going nowhere, you can be the one to choose to disengage and move on. That's okay. There are some disagreements within our clubs, within us and other people throughout that we just aren't going to solve. But we do need to somehow get to the point that we're going to agree to disagree. Conflict resolution behaviors and skills. There's a variety of these. Conflict always carries the risk of making people angry, hurting feelings, or being disappointed. If conflict is handled incorrectly, it can damage relationships, disrupt your work, and really affect your own personal well-being. So some of the certain behaviors and skills that we can use to minimize those risks are listed here. And we're going to talk through just a few of these. Staying calm is key. Anytime we want to react, we get tense or angry, that can totally escalate a problem and make it far worse than the actual problem might be. Think of strategies, and I encourage all of you to do this. Think of ways that you're able to help stay calm, whether it's a breathing technique, breathing deeply a few times, or stepping away for a moment. It's completely fine if you feel yourself getting worked up over something to say, I just need to take a few minutes and collect my thoughts. I don't want to say something irrash in the moment or something emotional. And that ties into managing your own emotions. If you're tired or stressed about things that aren't related to the conflict, that can feed into it. Are you irritated by certain words that people use or certain types, body language types? Be aware of the things that affect you negatively and how it affects your response. It takes a lot of self-control, as I mentioned before, but if you know those triggers, you can calmly work on ways that you can work your way through those so that you are staying calm and managing your emotions. Another big thing is listening. We're going to talk about listening quite a bit in just a moment, but don't assume that you know what the other person is upset about. Listen to what they have to say and ask questions to understand their perspective more. We're going to talk about some techniques to do that. You can still disagree, but you're going to be way far better equipped to find a resolution that works for both of you if you listen and truly know where you're going. Speak up. Just as you can't assume what other people are thinking, others can't read your mind, but be clear and specific about what is bothering you. Be tactful, get your point across, but be thoughtful. Saying things that are mean or aggressive aren't going to help the situation. Once again, go back to focus on the problem, not the person. We want to make sure that we don't criticize people. It can be very helpful to use the I statement to express your perspective. For example, rather than saying, I'll just use a random example. Instead of saying, you haven't paid me for that loan, say, I feel stressed because I thought I would have been repaid by now. Attacking areas of personal sensitivity can create an atmosphere that creates anger and vulnerability. And you want to make sure that you're not doing that. So focus on the problem, not the person, and not to attack things. And think about the present and the future, not the past. We all hold things about the past. I don't think there's any one of us that can ever say that there's not a past experience that doesn't influence something now. We're human. That happens. But when you're working on a specific problem or trying to have a conversation with someone, we can't change what's happened. Instead, we need to think about how to make this relationship more positive, how we can address the situation at hand, and how we can avoid certain similar situations in the future. Be aware of nonverbal communication, pay close attention to body language. You can read, we all know we can read a lot based on gestures, facial expressions, tone of voice, and posture, and be aware and respectful of differences as well. By avoiding disrespectful words and actions, we can often resolve a problem far quicker. So what are a few ground rules when you're trying to have a difficult conversation? Let's say there's a person in your club that has exhibited some rude behavior, maybe when you've had guests, and you know that that's not helping your club culture and not helping to get people to continue to come to meetings. How do you have that conversation with that person? It's not easy. It's not easy at all. And many of us would rather probably just avoid it and hope that that person just learns on their own, but not always going to happen. So we want to make sure that when we are talking about situations, and if you do have to address someone one-on-one or a small group, make sure you express your feelings in words, not actions. Telling someone directly and honestly how you feel or how you perceive something can be very powerful. It's a very powerful form of communication. If you start to feel angry or upset and you feel like you could lose control, once again, take a time out, do something to help yourself be steadier. But those first words, getting the conversation going, is key. Once you start doing that, make sure that you're only dealing with one issue at a time. We know that it's very easy to throw the whole kitchen sink into an argument and pile things on. That's only going to make it worse. If you're having a conversation, one issue at a time, and I encourage you to do one issue in a sitting even. Don't even start one issue and then say, oh, we've resolved that, let's go to the next one. No, because the person's going to feel very attacked. So make sure that you are dealing with only one issue at a time. Don't introduce other topics until you've fully resolved the first ones. Avoid accusations. We've kind of talked about that a little bit. Instead, talk about how someone's actions may have made you feel, make you feel. Bring it back to yourself. Don't generalize. Avoid words like never and always. We can all, I remember this, with my siblings. Every time it was, Mom, she always, or Dad, he always gets this. You never say never or always, because we all know that it's most likely an exaggeration and they're usually inaccurate and it will just heighten tensions. So avoid those generalizations. Also avoid make-believe scenarios. Exaggerating or inventing a complaint, or even your feelings about something that hasn't happened that might, will prevent the real issues from surfacing. So stick to the facts and be honest about what's going on and what's in reality right now, not what could happen or where this could go, because that's always even more subjective and makes the conversation more difficult. Don't stockpile. Storing up a lot of grievances and hurt feelings over time is counterproductive, and it's almost impossible to deal with those numerous old problems for which interpretations may differ. Try dealing with problems as soon as they arise. The sooner you can get started having a conversation, the better. Don't let things sit and build up. And also avoid clamming up. When a person becomes silent and stops responding to the other, frustration and anger can result. And that's on either side, whether it's you or the other person. Positive results can only happen with two-way conversation. And most importantly, learn how to listen. There are just simply by listening, if there's one thing you take away from this today, work on listening. When people are upset, the words that they use rarely convey the issues and needs that are really at the heart of the problem. When we listen for what is felt as well as what is said, we connect more deeply to not only our own needs and emotions, but those of other people. Listening in this way strengthens us, it informs us, and it makes it easier for us to hear others. So, what are some tips for being a better listener? Listen to the reason the person gives for being upset, and make sure you understand truly what they're telling you from their point of view. So many times we want to jump in and counter say something before they've even gotten their entire thoughts or feelings out. So make sure we listen to everything. Repeat their words and ask if you've understood correctly. Repeating is a great way to give you a moment even to make sure you've understood. And ask if you're missing anything. Give them time to answer. I often tell people, people don't like silence. We don't like silence by nature. If it's quiet, we feel like we need to keep talking. Give it a moment and say, is there anything I left out? Is this what I heard? And let it sit for a moment. Let them think about it and make sure that they've shared everything. And resist that temptation to interject your own point of view until they have completely said everything or what they want to say and feel, and that you've listened and understood. And what are some ways of doing that? And so I'm going to kind of close this section of the conversations out with a few tips here. And what we want to do is we want to start with that encouragement. When you're listening to the other person's point of view, the following responses can be super helpful. You encourage the other person to share his or her issues as fully as possible. Some phrases you could use: I want to understand what has upset you. I want to know what you're really hoping for. Fairly simple. We don't need to go into a big, long lecture or things we want to say. Just, I want to understand what's upset you. People want to know that you're listening to them. That's huge. Another big thing is to clarify. So once they've shared, clarify the real issue. Rather than making any assumptions, we all like to connect the dots. Ask questions that allow you to gain this information and which let the other person know that you're really trying to understand. Can you say more about that? Is that the way it usually happens? 3 very powerful words that I've used many, many times are simply, tell me more. People will get in and tell you more about what their issue is. And guess what? The majority of the time, they just needed someone to listen to them. If you listen to someone's issue, you're already 50% of the way of resolving that issue just by listening and simply saying, tell me more. I want to learn more. Then after that, restate what you've heard so that you're both able to see that what has been said so far, you've understood, they understand that you've been listening, and then it'll also help them realize if there's more information that is needed to share. So you can say things like, it sounds like you weren't expecting that to happen, or is that what happened? There's some empathy there, and they'll continue to share a little bit more. So those are some more key phrases and words that you can use. And then after you've restated, reflect. Reflect feelings and be as clear as possible. For instance, I can imagine how upsetting that might have been. Or I didn't realize how important that was to you. Or I didn't realize that this issue caused you so much pain. Show that you've reflected on this and that you care. Your concept or your solution or your ideas might be completely different, but you've already opened the conversation by showing some empathy and by sharing that you've listened and you realize something on your own. Typically, if you listen to someone and you realize something, they will listen to you back and realize something back about how you're feeling. So it's a great way to start the conversation. And finally, validate. Validate the concerns of the other person. Even if a solution seems elusive yet, validate. You express appreciation. It can be very powerful if it's conveyed with integrity and respect. Don't just say these words half heartedly and not listen and use these phrases, because guess what? People know that. People can see through you. That's body language, that's your tone. Truly try to listen to what people are saying and then come back with, I really appreciate that we're talking about this issue. I'm glad we're trying to figure this out. This has gone on way too long. We need to figure out how we can make this better. So those are just a few of the key ways that we can learn to have conversations. And I think the number one thing is that we just need to make sure that we don't let them sit out there for too long, because we all know that the longer we sit on something or ignore something, the harder it gets.